Alvin Plantinga's modal ontological argument is probably the best argument for the existence of God. It uses the laws of modal logic and acts similar to a mathematical proof. This is probably why a lot of people have a hard time understanding it and simply dismiss it. There are many great videos on the internet right now that give a great analysis of the ontological argument, yet many people ignore these videos because they find them too confusing. In this video, I'm going to try to articulate the argument in an easy way to understand, because if you're a theist, then it's important to understand this argument, because when understood correctly, it is impossible to refute. If you don't believe in a God, then it would probably be a good idea to understand it, so you don't appear foolish by misunderstanding it. To start, here's how the modal ontological argument works. Premise 1. It is possible that God exists. Premise 2. If it is possible that God exists, then God exists in some possible worlds. Premise 3. If God exists in some possible worlds, then God exists in all possible worlds. Premise 4. If God exists in all possible worlds, then God exists in the actual world. And premise 5. If God exists in the actual world, then God exists. Now, if you're like me when you first heard this, you're probably asking, well, wait, that doesn't make any sense. The logic of some of those premises doesn't add up. That's okay, because we're going to look at it closer so you can understand it. First, you should understand that when philosophers say a possible world, they mean a hypothetical situation. It is generally a way for philosophers to test an idea to see if it's logical by asking, could it exist in a possible world like ours? However, the one thing people seem to misunderstand the most in the argument is how God is defined. Some atheists say we're just imagining God into existence, like this clever bunch.
So here's my proof that a unicorn exists, and I actually wrote this passage. So let's define a unicorn as a magical equine being that has one horn and exists. By the above definition, such a being must exist. Therefore, a unicorn exists.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the ontological argument.
It's very hard to believe that there are people that use that, but there are.
The fact that the idea is there, so I can believe that I'm green and polka dotted.
Apparently.
Okay.
As long
Yes, apparently.
So, okay, ladies and gentlemen, I am green with purple polka dots. And since I have stated that, therefore it must be true.
Since you can imagine it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the problem. They are falling into the typical error of misunderstanding how God is defined, and because of their ignorance, they are concluding that the argument doesn't work. So we need to look at how God is actually defined and how it differs from how you would define a unicorn. Now, there are three ways to define a being or an entity in the ontological argument. An entity can either be impossible, which means it exists in no possible worlds. An example would be a square circle. An entity can be contingent, which means it exists in some possible worlds, like a unicorn. A unicorn could exist in some possible worlds, but not in others. Last, an entity can be necessary, which means it has to exist in all possible worlds. Now, what do we mean when we say something necessarily has to exist in all possible worlds? Well, examples of necessary entities are numbers, absolute truths, and shape definitions. For example, take the number 2. No one created it, it just exists necessarily. It can't not exist. Take a shape definition for another example, such as a square must have 4 sides. A square cannot exist with only 3 sides, because that would be logically incoherent in any possible world. So a necessary entity is something that cannot be false or fail to exist in any possible world. Therefore, necessarily, it has to exist in all possible worlds. So when we talk of God in this argument, we are saying that if he exists, he would have to be a necessary entity, because God is defined as a maximally great being, and a maximally great being is defined as a being that possesses all qualities that are better to have, which we define as great-making properties. Other examples are love, wisdom, and power. A maximally great being would also have to have these properties to their maximal extent. He would also possess no qualities that are bad to have, such as imperfection or corruption. These are defined as lesser-making properties. But most of all, he would have to possess the great-making property of necessity, because being necessary is a property that would be better to have. Now, looking back at the terms we defined earlier, if God was contingent, he wouldn't be maximally great, because he would only exist in some worlds, and would be less than great than if he existed in all worlds. Now, the idea of God being necessary is consistent with Scripture. Colossians 1:16 says, "For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him." So when skeptics try to debunk this argument by going through the premise with a unicorn in place of God, they are trying to define God in the same way you would define a contingent being. Whereas when we use God in the ontological argument, we are saying God is more than just contingent. He is maximally great, and anything maximally great must be a necessary entity, or it wouldn't be maximally great. So understanding how God is defined in the argument, let's go through the premises again. Premise 1. It is possible that God, a maximally great and necessary being, exists. Premise 2. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible worlds. Premise 3. If a maximally great being exists in some possible worlds, then a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds. Remember, if a maximally great being exists, then he has to be a necessary entity, because a contingent being cannot be maximally great. Premise 4. If a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds, then a maximally great being exists in the actual world, because the actual world is counted as one of the possible worlds. Premise 5. If a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. And the conclusion is, a maximally great being exists. So does it feel convincing? Well, not really. But when it boils down, it's not a matter of how you feel. What matters is what is logically coherent. So hopefully now that you know how God is defined in the argument, you can understand how the ontological argument works. Are there objections to the argument? Yes, but only in premise 1, since the other premises just follow modal logic and are uncontroversial. The only way for skeptics to debunk this argument is to show that it is impossible for a maximally great being to exist. The most common way this is tried is with the omnipotence paradox. It is most commonly presented like this. Can God create a stone so heavy that even he can't move? If God cannot create the stone, then he is not all-powerful. But if God can create the stone and can't move it, then he is still not all-powerful. Therefore, the idea of God is impossible. However, this attempt is debunked in the question itself as a logical absurdity. Asking can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy even he can't move implies that omnipotence is defined as able to do the logically impossible, which is not consistent with the definition of omnipotence. No one who believes in omnipotent God believes God can do the logically impossible. The Bible has verses that state it's impossible for God to do certain things. Asking the question is like asking, can an omnipotent being create a square with 3 sides? Or can an omnipotent being tell you the shape of purple? Or can an omnipotent being tote an 11? It's just gibberish. All these questions are logically incoherent and cannot exist in any possible world, so you cannot expect them to be answered. Now you might be asking, well, why can't God do the logically impossible? He is all-powerful, so he should be able to do anything. Well, you need to understand that logic derives from order. Without order, nothing makes sense, including existence. So you cannot use logical absurdities to disprove the existence of God. Because if logical absurdities were in a world along with God, then essentially nothing in that world could actually exist. So once again, you cannot use logical absurdities to disprove the existence of God, especially in modal logic. If one side uses logic to prove the existence of God, the other side cannot step outside of logic to disprove God. That'd be like a football game where one team gets to use machetes. This is why the omnipotence paradox is not accepted in academia as a valid argument. There are of course other objections to the argument. However, I'm not going to address them now, because this video is intended to be an introduction to the ontological argument, and I feel I've already overloaded your head with too much information. I cover the most popular objections to the argument in another video, which you can check out later. If this video still has you confused, I would recommend watching it again. The ontological argument is not an argument that some people can fully grasp right away, so please, reflect on the idea before you dismiss it. It took me a little bit of reflecting before I fully understood it, and I wouldn't expect anything different from someone else. In the information section below, I've provided links to other great videos on the ontological argument. I hope you'll check them out, and continue to research and study this amazing argument.